was early November in Ohio, and the air had that damp chill that clung to your bones. I was working my third consecutive midnight shift at a small manufacturing plant just outside of Youngstown. It wasn't glamorous work, just overseeing automated machines that stamped metal brackets for cars, but it paid decently and the nights were usually calm. Most of the guys hated the graveyard shift, but I preferred it. Fewer people, less noise. Just me, the hum of machinery, and the occasional clank of metal echoing through the big hollow building. That night, I was covering for a coworker who'd called in sick, which meant I was completely alone. Normally, there was at least one other person in the building, a security guard or a maintenance tech, but our company had been cutting costs, and I'd drawn the short straw. I arrived around 11:45 p.m., punched in, and walked through the dimly lit factory floor. The overhead lights flickered every now and then, and I could hear the low hum of the conveyor belts that never really stopped. Everything looked the same as always. Cold metal machines, pallets stacked with parts, the faint smell of oil and dust. The first hour was uneventful. I checked the stamping line, refilled some lubricant, and sat in the small break room with a cup of coffee, scrolling through my phone. Around 1:10 a.m., I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't loud, just a metallic clang followed by a scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. I froze. The machines made a lot of noise, sure, but this was different. Slow, deliberate. I put my coffee down and listened. Nothing for a few seconds. Then another scrape. It was coming from the far end of the plant, near the shipping area. I told myself it was probably one of the machines catching on something. There was maybe a loose part on the conveyor belt. Still, something about it made the hairs on my neck stand up. I grabbed my flashlight and started walking down the main aisle. The light bounced off the metal walls, making every shadow shift like it was alive. The sound stopped as I got closer. The shipping bay was empty. No forklifts, no workers, just stacks of boxed-up parts waiting for pickup. "Hello?" I called out, feeling stupid the moment the word left my mouth. My voice echoed down the hall, bouncing off the walls. Silence. I stood there for a moment, scanning the room. Nothing. Then, just as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange near the big roll-up door. A set of footprints on the dusty concrete floor. Bare footprints. I froze. They started near the door, leading inward. 10 distinct human footprints. No shoes, no socks, and what made it worse, they were wet, like someone had stepped in water before walking in. I followed them with my flashlight, my stomach twisting tighter with every step. The prints led between two stacks of crates and stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished mid-stride. I crouched down, shining my light on the spot. The last print looked smudged, almost like it had been dragged slightly to the side. I felt a chill crawl up my arms. I didn't know what to make of it. The door had been locked when I came in. There was no sign anyone had entered. I backed away slowly, telling myself it had to be an old spill or a trick of condensation. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I went back to the break room, trying to focus on my coffee and ignore the uneasy weight in my chest. I kept telling myself I was just tired. But that theory went out the window about 30 minutes later. I was sitting there when the lights flickered. Once, twice. Then they cut out completely. The whole plant went black except for the dim glow from the emergency exit signs. The hum of the machinery stopped, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and got up. The power had never gone out before, not once in the year I'd worked there. Then, faintly, I heard something move. Not the scraping sound from earlier. This was softer, slower. The sound of footsteps, bare feet against concrete. I turned in a full circle, scanning the room with my light. Nothing. The beam hit walls, machines, stacks of metal parts, but no person. Still, the footsteps kept going, steady, unhurried, coming closer. My throat went dry. "Who's there?" I said, my voice cracking. "If someone's messing around, knock it off." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then I heard breathing. Deep, slow breathing. Somewhere in the dark, maybe 20 feet away, I aimed my light toward the sound. The beam landed on something, someone, standing behind one of the machines. A figure, tall, pale, unmoving. Its head was tilted at a strange angle like it was studying me. I froze. The light trembled in my hand. I could only see parts of it between the machinery, shoulders, a hand gripping the edge of the metal, the faint outline of a face that didn't look quite right. I blinked, and it was gone. I backed up until I hit the wall, my breathing quick and shallow. My phone buzzed suddenly in my pocket, making me jump so hard I nearly dropped it. It was a text from an unknown number. Don't look for it. My blood ran cold. I called out again, louder this time, trying to sound braver than I felt. Who's there? This isn't funny. No answer. Then a metallic clang echoed from the far side of the plant, loud, violent, like someone had slammed one of the machine hoods shut. The sound reverberated through the whole building, making the floor vibrate under my boots. I bolted toward the control room, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Inside, the emergency lights cast everything in a sickly red glow. I tried calling my supervisor, but my phone had no signal. The landline didn't work either. The power outage had killed everything. I sat there in the corner, gripping a wrench like a weapon, listening. The footsteps came back, slow, deliberate. I could hear them just outside the control room door. Then, scraping. The sound of fingernails or claws dragging down the metal door. I held my breath. Then it stopped. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. I finally got the courage to look through the small glass window on the door. Nothing. I let out a shaky breath and turned around, only to see a wet, bare footprint on the control room floor. It hadn't been there before. I backed against the wall, flashlight shaking in my grip. The lights flickered again. For half a second, the red emergency light cut out, and in that half second, I saw something in the reflection of the glass window. A face. Right behind me. Pale. Hollow eyes. Mouth hanging open like it wanted to scream, but couldn't. When the lights came back on, I was alone. The power returned around 3 a.m. The machines roared back to life, humming as though nothing had happened. The control room door was covered in deep scratches. No one could explain it. The cameras had all gone black from 1 to 12 to 3:31. Every second of that 2-hour window was missing. When the morning shift arrived, I told my supervisor about the power failure, but didn't mention the footprints or what I'd seen. He sent maintenance to check the breaker panels. They said nothing was wrong. I quit 2 days later. A week after I left, I got a call from my old coworker, Steve. He'd taken over my shift. He sounded shaken. "Man," he said quietly, "did you ever see anything weird in that place?" I didn't answer. He hesitated, then said, "Last night the power went out around 1 a.m. I swear I heard footsteps. When it came back on, there were wet prints on the floor near the shipping bay." My chest went cold. I asked him if he'd checked the cameras. He said he had, and there was something standing near the machines at 1:09 a.m. Something tall, barefoot, watching him. I told him to quit. He laughed nervously and said he might. That was 2 months ago. Last week I got another call from an unknown number. When I answered, all I heard was deep, slow breathing. Then, faintly, a whisper, "You left the door open." Story the end. It was my first week on the midnight shift at Jefferson General, a hospital that had been around since the 1950s. I'd been hired as a night tech, covering a temp position for the graveyard hours. The orientation had been quick, and most of what I learned was how to check vitals, restock supplies, and avoid getting lost in the labyrinthine hallways of the old building. What nobody told me was how different the hospital felt after dark. The first hour passed quietly. I walked through the corridors, checking on post-op patients and logging vitals. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the hum of the machinery was the only sound besides my footsteps. Around 1 a.m., I noticed something strange in the east wing. A nurse had mentioned that wing was usually quiet, almost deserted at night, but the feeling there was off. The air felt heavier, the shadows longer. I chalked it up to my nerves. By 2 a.m., I had started my rounds in the ICU. Most of the patients were stable, hooked up to monitors that beeped quietly. That's when I first noticed it, a figure standing at the end of the hall. I froze. The silhouette was tall, but it didn't move like a human. When I blinked, it was gone. I shook my head and moved on, telling myself I was imagining things. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. Every time I turned a corner, every time I stepped past a room, I felt eyes on me. It was a presence that I couldn't see, but I could feel. By 3 a.m., I was tense, hyper-aware of every sound. The squeak of a cart, the low hum of a ventilator, the whisper of air through the ducts. Then the monitors started acting strangely. Heart rate readings flickered, flatlining for a moment before returning to normal. I went room to room to check, but every patient was fine. Still, the machines kept flickering as if registering something unseen. Around 3:30 a.m., I was in the supply closet restocking bandages when I heard a faint dragging sound from down the hall. It was slow, deliberate. I froze, holding my breath. The hospital was quiet, empty, but the sound kept coming, closer and closer. I stepped out of the closet, flashlight trembling in my hand. Down the corridor, I saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was hunched over, moving silently, gliding just above the floor. Its head was turned toward me. There were no eyes, just darkness where a face should have been. Panic surged through me. I ran. My shoes squeaked against the tile as I sprinted down the hallways, trying to find another staff member, another soul who could help. The figure followed, slow but relentless, its presence suffocating. I reached the nurse's station, empty. Chairs pushed in, computers locked, the monitors showing nothing. I grabbed the phone to call security, but the line was dead. The overhead lights flickered and went out, the ones plunging me into darkness. Then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural. "You shouldn't be here." It whispered directly into my ear. I spun around, but no one was there. The air was cold, heavy, like something had wrapped itself around me. My flashlight flickered again, revealing movement just beyond the beam, a shadow that stretched impossibly long down the hall, shifting and curling. I ran blindly, corridors twisting in ways I didn't recognize. Rooms led to dead ends. Doors I had passed before now opened into storage closets. The hospital felt alive, changing around me. My heart pounded as I stumbled into the basement. The smell was damp and metallic, the lights dim and flickering. That's when I saw them, faces pressed against the walls, dozens of them, pale, screaming, silently. The last face closest to me was my own, my mouth frozen in a silent scream. I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty halls. The figure moved closer, the sound of dragging feet behind me growing louder. I ran until I found the stairwell to the main lobby and burst through the doors, gasping. The lobby was normal, the lights were on. Security was at his desk. Nothing had happened. When I tried to explain, he gave me a sympathetic smile. "Midnight shifts get to everyone. Maybe take the next one off." I quit the next morning. I haven't returned since, but even now, months later, I can't forget it. I still see those faces in reflections, hear that low, guttural whisper. I know it wasn't a hallucination, it wasn't stress or sleep deprivation. Something was in that hospital, waiting, patient, silent, watching. And I know that wherever it is, it's still there, waiting for the next person unlucky enough to wander the midnight halls alone. Story, the end. I had been working nights at the hospital for a few months when the strange things started happening. I was a night shift nurse at a small community hospital in Michigan, and the night crew was usually quiet. Just me, the night charge nurse, a few techs, and the occasional patient wandering the halls. The hospital itself was old, built in the 1950s, with long, narrow hallways, outdated elevators, and a basement that smelled like damp concrete and cleaning chemicals. The day shifts ran smoothly, but nights were different. It began on my third week. Around 2:30 a.m., I was walking down the east wing to check on Mr. Henderson, an elderly man recovering from surgery. The hallways were silent, except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the squeak of my shoes on the linoleum. As I approached his room, I thought I heard a whisper. Not from a patient, more like a faint, urgent murmur echoing off the walls. I paused, looking around, but no one was there. I shrugged it off as my imagination. Hospitals at night have that way of playing tricks on you. Shadows stretch, noises echo, and you're always half asleep. But the whispers kept happening. Sometimes they were near patient rooms, sometimes near empty hallways, always so faint I could barely make them out. And every time I tried to call out, my voice seemed swallowed by the building. One night, around 3 a.m., I was doing routine vitals in the ICU. The unit was mostly empty, just two patients and me. I heard the soft wheezing of Mr. Linton, a man in his 70s on oxygen. But beneath it, I heard something else. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving behind the nurse's station. I looked up. Nobody was there. I grabbed my walkie, intending to call the charge nurse. No response. The static hissed, then a faint whisper came through. "Help." My heart froze. It didn't sound like a voice from a patient, and the pitch was wrong. Too low, too hollow. I turned toward the hall. The lights flickered, then went out completely. Emergency lights kicked on, casting an eerie red glow across the room. Shadows stretched across the walls in impossible angles. I tried to convince myself it was just a power surge, a trick of the light. But then I saw movement at the end of the hallway. A figure, standing just inside the ICU doorway. Tall, thin, hunched slightly, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. Its face was hidden in shadow. I froze, gripping the edge of the counter. The figure tilted its head unnaturally, staring directly at me. I backed away slowly, trying not to turn my back. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was rooted in place. The figure didn't move for several long seconds. Then, without warning, it darted down the hall, faster than any human could. I called out for help, but no one answered. The emergency lights flickered again, and the figure vanished. For the rest of the shift, I avoided the East Wing entirely. I stayed near the nurses' station, keeping the lights on and talking on the walkie constantly. When morning came, I reported the incident to the charge nurse. She frowned, but told me the security cameras showed nothing unusual, just empty hallways. The next week, the occurrences intensified. Equipment would move on its own. IV stands toppled, monitors beeped for no reason, and the whispering voices returned, louder this time, sounding like multiple people. Around 1:30 a.m., the PA system sometimes crackled with garbled sounds, almost like someone was speaking through it, but no words could be made out. One night, I was checking on a patient in room 214. The lights flickered, and I heard the sound of breathing, slow, deep, not matching the patient's. I turned slowly and saw the figure standing in the corner of the room, its head tilted, face still hidden, and it wasn't moving naturally. The shadows around it seemed to warp, bending in ways that made the walls ripple. I froze. My flashlight fell to the floor. When I bent down to grab it, the figure was gone, but the breathing remained, echoing around the room. I ran out and slammed the door behind me. After that, I requested a transfer to the day shift, but the hospital was short-staffed. I had no choice but to keep working nights. Each shift, the activity escalated. Patients reported seeing someone at the foot of their beds. Nurses found notes scratched on windows or walls that weren't there before, and shadows would move independently of any light source. The worst night was in the basement. The hospital basement was always cold and smelled like mold and rust. I had been sent to retrieve some supplies. As I walked down the concrete stairs, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, nobody. The lights flickered again, and a shadow moved across the far wall. I heard the whisper, urgent and panicked, "Leave." I ran to the storage room, but the door slammed shut behind me. My flashlight flickered and went out. I was in complete darkness. I could hear breathing all around me and faint scratching at the walls. I banged on the door, screaming. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know. When the door finally opened, the basement was empty. The footprints in the dust led nowhere. I quit 2 nights later. I packed my things and left without a word. But the nightmares followed me. In dreams, I see the hallways stretching endlessly, the shadowy figure tilting its head, whispering my name. Sometimes I wake up with scratches on my arms or a cold draft across my neck, like it followed me home. I heard years later that the hospital underwent renovations. Some nurses quit without explanation, and patients sometimes reported the same sightings. Security footage would always be missing or corrupted around 2 a.m. I don't work nights anymore. I don't go into abandoned hospitals or dark basements. I avoid empty buildings. But every time I drive past a hospital at night, I feel it. The presence, watching from the shadows, waiting for someone foolish enough to wander the halls alone after midnight. Story the end. It was a little past 11:30 p.m. when I arrived at the small, family-owned convenience store on the outskirts of town. I had started the midnight shift 2 months prior. The store sat on a quiet road surrounded by empty fields and dense woods, the kind of place where the only traffic after dark was the occasional trucker or a lost late-night traveler. I clocked in, grabbed a cup of coffee, and started my usual routine. Wiping down counters, checking the shelves, making sure the lottery tickets were stocked. Most nights were boring. The hum of the refrigerators, the flicker of the fluorescent lights, and the occasional beep of the scanner were the only sounds that accompanied me. But tonight, the air felt heavier. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. a faint tapping sound coming from the back of the store. At first, I thought it was just a rat or a loose pipe, but the rhythm was deliberate. Tap, 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 slow, uneven. I froze, listening, my heart rate climbing. I went to check the back storage room, flashlight in hand. Everything looked normal. Boxes stacked neatly, cleaning supplies in their place. The sound stopped the moment I opened the door. I chalked it up to nerves and went back to the counter, shaking slightly. At 1 a.m., the store phone rang. We rarely got calls, and the display showed unknown caller. I hesitated but answered. Hello? Nothing. Just silence. Then, faintly, a soft whisper. I couldn't make out words, just a hissing, almost like someone was breathing into the phone. I hung up immediately, my hands trembling. I tried to focus on work, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every shadow seemed too dark, every creak too intentional. At 2 a.m., a man walked in. He was tall and thin, wearing a hoodie that covered most of his face. Do you sell cigarettes? He asked in a low, raspy voice. I nodded, keeping my distance. As I reached for the pack, I noticed something strange. His fingers were long, unnaturally long, and his skin was pale, almost gray. My gut told me to step back, but I forced myself to stay calm. Cash or card? I asked. Cash, he replied. He handed me crumpled bills, and I gave him the pack. The moment he left, I realized the door hadn't actually opened when he entered. There was no jingle of the bell, no movement, nothing. I backed away from the counter, my heart hammering. I checked the security cameras. Nothing. No man, no entry. Just the empty parking lot and the faint glow of the streetlight outside. By 3 a.m., I was convinced I was imagining things. Maybe too many late nights, maybe too much coffee. I went around the store, checking aisles and shelves, trying to reassure myself. That's when I noticed the footprints. They weren't normal shoes prints. They were long, narrow, bare, and smeared with something dark. They led from the back storage room toward the front door, then stopped abruptly. I shined my flashlight around. Nothing. No one was there. I locked the doors, checked the back, and sat at the counter trying to keep my composure. The minutes dragged on, the silence growing oppressive. At 4 a.m., I saw movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow flickered near the display of snacks. I swung my flashlight toward it. Nothing. Just the flickering neon sign outside, casting weird angles. Then I heard it. A low whistle. 2 short, sharp notes. I froze. My heart was in my throat. The whistle came again, this time from directly behind me. I spun around. The aisle was empty. The smell hit me before I could see anything. Rotting, wet earth, like someone had been crawling through the woods and brought the forest with them. I tried to leave, but the front door wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside, and the keys were on the counter. Panic rose in me. I ran to the back door. It opened without resistance, and cold night air hit me like a wall. I glanced toward the dumpsters in the alley. A figure stood there. Tall, thin, gray-skinned, with elongated limbs, its head tilted slightly, unnaturally. And it whistled again. 2 short notes, exact, deliberate. I ran, heart pounding, not looking back. I didn't stop until I reached my car parked down the road. I locked the doors and drove straight to the highway, not slowing down until I reached town. I called the police. They were polite but skeptical, took my statement, and sent a patrol car to check the store in the morning. When I returned a few hours later in daylight, everything was normal. No footprints, no strange smells, no signs of forced entry. I never returned for another night shift. I switched to a day job at a grocery store in town. But sometimes when the wind is still and quiet, I hear that whistle in my head. 2 short, sharp notes, like someone standing just outside, watching, waiting. Years later, I read about a man who disappeared from a similar store in the same county, last seen during the midnight shift. Witnesses reported a strange, pale figure with long limbs, but no one ever found him. I can't help but wonder if it's the same thing I saw that night. And every time I drive past an empty store at midnight, I find myself gripping the wheel tighter, scanning the shadows, waiting for that same 2-note whistle. Story the end. The call came in just after midnight, a routine alarm from the storage facility on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. Logan had taken the midnight shift as a security guard, mostly for the quiet and the overtime pay. The job was simple: monitor cameras, do rounds, and make sure no one broke in. Most nights, he'd sit in the small office, scrolling on his phone, sipping lukewarm coffee, and listening to the faint hum of the building's ventilation. But that night, the silence felt heavier, oppressive, like the air itself was pressing down on him. It started around 12:30 a.m. during Logan's first round. The facility was a maze of metal storage units, aisles stretching far into darkness. The cameras were black and white, grainy, but sufficient. He scanned each feed, noting the occasional flicker of a light or the shadow of a moving rat. Then, on camera 7, he noticed something strange. A figure stood at the far end of an aisle, a tall, thin shape, hunched slightly, completely still. At first, Logan thought it was a trespasser. He grabbed his flashlight and headed down the aisle, his boots echoing unnaturally in the empty building. But when he reached the end, the figure was gone. The air smelled faintly metallic, like rust mixed with blood, though nothing was visible. Logan shook his head. Probably a trick of the shadows, he muttered to himself. By 1:45 a.m., the feeling of being watched had intensified. Every corner he passed seemed to hold movement just at the edge of his vision. The fluorescent lights flickered sporadically, casting long, writhing shadows. Logan tried to convince himself it was fatigue, that his mind was playing tricks on him. Around 2:15 a.m., the intercom in the office buzzed. A faint whisper came through, distorted and broken, repeating his name. Logan! Logan! The voice wasn't human. It was warped, wet, and hissing. Logan's pulse quickened. He grabbed his flashlight and walked toward the main hallway. The sound seemed to follow him, circling, echoing, but never coming from a single direction. He reached the central corridor and stopped dead. The lights above flickered violently, and through the strobing, he saw them, figures. Multiple shapes, tall and thin, standing at the edges of the aisles, almost blending with the darkness. Their heads tilted unnaturally, eyes hollow, mouths slightly open. None moved, but the feeling of their presence pressed against him like a physical weight. Logan's flashlight flickered and went out. He fumbled to turn it back on, and when the beam returned, the figures were closer. The sound of scraping filled the corridor, slow and deliberate, like claws dragged along metal. Panic surged through him. He tried to run, but the layout had changed. The aisles stretched farther, the units rearranged into a twisted maze. Every turn brought him back to the same central corridor, the figures always just at the edge of the light. He reached for his radio, but static filled the line, drowning out his calls for help. Then he saw it, a tall figure directly in front of him, its head cocked at an impossible angle, staring. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, veins visible beneath the surface. It didn't move, yet Logan felt it watching him, its presence crawling into his mind. The whispering grew louder, joined by wet, gurgling sounds that seemed to come from every direction. Logan backed into a storage unit door and collided with it. The door rattled, then swung open on its own. Inside, darkness stretched impossibly far, deeper than the facility should have allowed. From within, he heard scratching, whispering, the low sound of something dragging across the floor. Logan stumbled in, flashlight trembling in his hands. The walls of the unit seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding subtly. The whispering formed words, though they weren't words Logan knew. They were a language of pressure, insistence, of warning and hunger combined. The floor beneath him seemed to move, tilting slightly, guiding him deeper into the dark. Then he saw them, dozens of figures, pressed into the walls, their heads tilted, mouths open in silent screams. Some reached toward him, their hands skeletal and wet, brushing the edge of his jacket. Logan tried to turn and run, but the exit was gone, replaced by walls. The ceiling stretched higher, the fluorescent hum warping into a low, vibrating tone that rattled his teeth. He collapsed to the ground, heart hammering, breathing sharp and ragged. The figures surrounded him now, moving impossibly close without moving, their hollow eyes fixed on him. Logan's mind screamed to flee, to fight, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by sheer, overwhelming presence. Time lost all meaning. Minutes, hours, maybe seconds. He couldn't tell. The scraping, whispering, and wet gurgling sounds became deafening, echoing inside his skull. He shut his eyes, willing it to end. When he opened them, it was morning. Sunlight poured through the facility's windows. The storage units were back in their normal arrangement. The figures were gone. The scraping and whispering had vanished. The front office radio crackled, static clearing to normal. Logan ran out of the building, never looking back. He quit that day and refused to talk about what had happened. Even now, months later, he sometimes wakes at 3 a.m., sweating and hearing faint whispers, soft scraping, and the hum of fluorescent lights that aren't there. He knows deep down that the facility isn't empty, that it never will be. Somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the next midnight shift worker to stumble into the maze, the figures are patient, silent, and hungry. Story the end. It was early March in rural Kentucky when I picked up the midnight shift at a small, independently owned gas station off Highway 68. I needed the money after a string of short-term jobs, and the owner, a wiry man named Ray, promised me that the hours were easy and the traffic was light. "Nothing happens here after midnight," he said. I should have taken that as a warning. The first week was typical. Truckers stopping for coffee, the occasional student picking up snacks, and long stretches of nothing. The station sat alone, flanked by cornfields that stretched as far as the eye could see. The building was old, the kind with flickering fluorescent lights, a drafty back room, and the faint smell of oil and cleaning chemicals lingering in the air. Around 1 a.m., I usually took a break, leaned back in the chair behind the counter, and listened to the hum of the refrigerator. That night, though, something felt off. The air seemed heavier, like it was pressing down on me. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the metal awning above the pumps, and I could hear something moving in the cornfields, soft, deliberate crunching, though the snow and frost on the ground should have muffled it. I shook my head. "Just the wind," I muttered to myself. At 1:15 a.m., a man walked in. He was tall, skinny, with pale skin that almost glowed under the flickering lights. His clothes were dark, heavy, and soaked, as if he'd been standing in the rain for hours. He didn't look at me when he entered. He just moved straight to the snack aisle, fingers grazing the tops of the shelves. I cleared my throat. "Evening. Coffee, soda, anything?" He didn't respond. He just kept walking slowly down the aisles. There was something wrong about him. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Then I realized he wasn't breathing. I didn't see his chest rise. I didn't hear the faint exhale everyone emits. I stepped closer. "Sir?" I said cautiously. Finally, he looked at me. His eyes were completely black, no whites, no iris, just a deep, endless darkness. He tilted his head slightly, almost inquisitively. Then he whispered, "They're coming." I froze. My voice caught in my throat. "Who's coming?" He didn't answer. He just turned and walked toward the back door of the station, pausing at the corner of the counter as if to make sure I was watching. Then he disappeared. I told myself he must have left, but when I walked to the back door, it was locked. I checked the lot outside. Empty. No footprints. No truck. Nothing. An hour later at 2:30 a.m., the door jingled again. I looked up from restocking the soda fridge, and a woman stepped inside. She was shaking, her coat torn, and her hair matted with snow and ice. She rushed to the counter, panting like she had been running for miles. "Please," she said, voice trembling, "you have to help me. They're out there. They're coming." Before I could ask who they were, the lights flickered violently and the heater clicked off. The temperature dropped instantly, making my breath visible in the air. A low, wet thump echoed from the front of the building. Then another. The sound of something heavy dragging itself across the asphalt outside. I ran to the door, ready to call 911, but my hands froze on the handle. Peering out through the glass, I could see shadows moving across the lot. Not like people walking, more like figures sliding along the ground, limbs bending at wrong angles, moving silently and impossibly fast. The woman screamed and bolted for the back door, but before she could reach it, a pair of those figures appeared in the back lot, intercepting her. She yelled again, but it wasn't a normal human scream. It was warped, gurgling, and somehow echoed in the building, as if the sound was coming from inside me too. I panicked and grabbed the keys to lock the back door. By the time I did, the figures had gone. The lot was empty, though the frost had been disturbed, marks that looked like footprints, but impossibly long and thin, leading from the field toward the back entrance. I tried to call the police. No dial tone. The line was dead. My cell phone showed no signal. Nothing worked. For the next 2 hours, the lights continued to flicker, shadows appeared in the corners of the lot, and the soft scraping of fingers on glass echoed from the front windows. Every time I dared to look outside, there was nothing, until I blinked, and they were there. Figures at the edge of the lot, just beyond the pumps, staring at me with eyes that shouldn't exist. By 5 a.m., I was shaking uncontrollably, crouched behind the counter with a baseball bat I found in the storage room. The sun began to rise slowly, washing the lot in pale orange light. The figures vanished completely with the dawn. When the manager came in later to relieve me, I told him what happened. He frowned, sighed, and said nothing. Later that week, I found out I wasn't the first employee to experience something strange on the midnight shift. A few former workers had quit abruptly, citing things in the lot, voices, or shadows moving too fast. None of them ever wanted to talk about it. I quit the next night. I never went back. But sometimes when I drive past that stretch of highway on winter nights, I see lights flickering from that gas station, even when it's closed. And I swear in the wind I hear whispers, "They're coming. Don't let them in." Story the end. The first night I worked the midnight shift at Riverview Medical Center, I thought it would be like any other hospital graveyard shift I'd worked before. I'd covered nights at smaller clinics. But this was my first time in a larger hospital, one with multiple floors, old wings, and hallways that seemed to stretch endlessly. The building smelled faintly of disinfectant, mildew, and something else I couldn't identify. I clocked in at 11:55 p.m., grabbed a cup of coffee from the break room, and walked the quiet halls. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, a constant buzz that settled into your skull after a while. At first, everything was routine. I checked on post-op patients, took vitals, and restocked supplies. The night staff was minimal, only a few nurses, a security guard, and me roaming the corridors. By 1 a.m., I noticed the air had shifted. It was colder than usual, though the heat was on. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, and the quiet seemed to press against me. When I walked past the ICU, the machines hummed steadily, but one heart monitor flickered for a second, flatlining before returning to normal. I thought maybe it was a glitch, but the flicker repeated at random intervals in different rooms. At 2:15 a.m., I was in the East Wing, checking vitals for a patient recovering from abdominal surgery. That's when I first felt it, the sense of being watched. I froze, scanning the corridor. The hallway was empty, but the feeling persisted. My stomach twisted, a cold pit of dread settling in. A faint sound came from down the hall, a soft dragging, slow and deliberate. I told myself it was probably a janitor or someone moving equipment, but when I peeked around the corner, the hall was empty. The sound stopped as soon as I moved forward, then started again behind me, closer this time. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nothing there. By 3 a.m., I was on edge. Every shadow seemed alive, twisting as I passed. The monitors in the empty rooms flickered inexplicably, lights dimming and brightening in unnatural patterns. I went to check room 312, which had been vacant for days. The bed was neatly made, but I could hear the faint sound of breathing. "Hello?" I called softly. No reply. I moved closer, the breathing growing louder, closer, though the bed was empty. A cold draft brushed my neck, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly, flashlight sweeping the room, and for a moment I saw a figure standing near the window. It was tall, hunched slightly, its face obscured in shadow. When I blinked, it was gone. I backed out into the hall, heart racing. The lights flickered, plunging the corridor into darkness for a moment. I heard the dragging sound again, now accompanied by faint, wet breathing, slow and deliberate. My pulse spiked. I ran. I sprinted past the nurse's station, empty, silent, and down the hallways that now seemed to twist unnaturally. Doors I had passed before led to storage closets. Corridors curved where they shouldn't. I felt the presence behind me, moving with a rhythm that matched my fear. I ended up in the basement, a section of the hospital I hadn't seen during orientation. The air was damp and cold, smelling of rust and mildew. Dim emergency lights flickered weakly, casting elongated shadows along the walls. And then I saw them, faces pressed against the concrete, pale, eyes wide, mouths open in silent screams. The closest face was my own, twisted in terror. I stumbled back, heart pounding, and ran blindly through the basement corridors until I found the stairs to the lobby. I burst through the doors, gasping. The hospital looked normal again, as if nothing had happened. When I tried to tell the night staff what I had seen, they smiled politely. "Midnight shifts get to everyone," one nurse said. "You'll get used to it." I didn't. I quit the next morning. Even now, months later, I can't stop seeing those faces in reflections, hearing that slow, deliberate breathing when I'm alone. I know it wasn't stress or sleep deprivation. Whatever I saw in the hospital, it was real, and it's still there somewhere, waiting for the next person unlucky enough to walk the midnight halls alone. Story the end. The call came in just after midnight. Derek had been working the night shift at the Mercyville Hospital for almost a year now, and he had learned to expect the strange, the unsettling, and the just plain weird. But nothing prepared him for what happened that night. Derek was assigned to the third floor, the long-term care wing that mostly housed patients recovering from surgeries or with chronic illnesses. The floor was quiet at this hour, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead, the distant beeping of monitors, and occasional wheeled carts breaking the silence. Derek had made his rounds, checked the vitals of the sleeping patients, and was about to grab a cup of coffee in the break room when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was panicked. "There's something in room 312. You need to get here. Now." Derek frowned. The floor had strict protocols. Only call the nurse or security if a patient's condition deteriorated or if there was an emergency. But the voice sounded terrified, and it wasn't a patient. It sounded like one of the cleaning staff, although her voice quivered in a way that made his stomach tighten. He grabbed his flashlight and a set of keys and walked down the dimly lit hallway toward room 312. The air felt heavy, colder than usual, and the faint smell of antiseptic was mixed with something else, something metallic, like blood. He reached the door and saw that it was slightly ajar. "Hello?" Derek called softly, trying to keep his voice steady. No response. He pushed the door open slowly and shone his flashlight inside. The room was empty, but the bed was rumpled as if someone had been lying there recently. A thin mist seemed to hover near the floor, curling around the wheels of the bed. The lights flickered overhead, and then he heard it, a soft, scraping sound from the corner of the room. Derek's heart pounded. He scanned the room with his flashlight. There was nothing there, until the beam caught movement in the reflection of the window. A figure was standing in the hallway outside, just at the edge of the glass. Tall, thin, its head cocked unnaturally to one side, arms hanging limp. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, Derek couldn't see the eyes. They were just empty, dark holes. He blinked, and the figure was gone. "Okay," he whispered to himself, trying to rationalize. "Maybe it's a trick of the light. Maybe I'm just tired." He stepped into the hallway and walked toward the nurse's station, but the lights in the corridor flickered violently. The temperature dropped sharply, and his breath fogged in the cold air. The whispers began then, faint at first, curling around the walls, echoing through the long, empty hallway. Derek froze. He could hear them clearly now, soft, urgent, calling his name, though not in words he could understand. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere at once, circling him, pressing against his eardrums. He ran toward the nurse's station, hoping someone else was awake, someone could help. The phones were dead. The intercom crackled and then went silent. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. No matter how fast he ran, he ended up back in front of room 312. The bed had moved. Now it was near the center of the hallway, wheels scraping softly against the floor. Derek's flashlight beam caught the edge of the mattress, and something was lying on it. A body. Pale, thin, face pressed downward. But when he approached, it lifted its head, and it wasn't a patient. The face was distorted, as if stretched and hollow, and the mouth opened wide, emitting a low, wet gurgle that made Derek stumble back. The whispers grew louder, now joined by a dragging sound like fingernails across the linoleum floor. Derek tried to run, but the hallway shifted. Doors that had been closed were now open, walls bending slightly as if the building itself was alive. Shadows twisted in corners, moving against the light. Then the figure appeared again, standing at the end of the hallway. This one was taller, arms too long, head tilted, impossibly. It didn't move at first, just stared, silent, and Derek felt a cold pressure on his chest, like the air itself was pressing him down. He turned to run back into room 312, but the door slammed shut before he could reach it. He pounded on it, screaming, but no one answered. The dragging sound was closer now, circling the room, whispering louder, the words still incomprehensible, but urgent, demanding, like a warning. Desperate, Derek tried the emergency exit near the end of the wing. The door wouldn't budge. Every handle on the floor seemed frozen in place, unyielding. The lights flickered one last time, and he realized he was no longer alone. Figures were everywhere now, standing silently watching, some barely visible in the shadows, others illuminated by the flickering lights. They weren't moving, not really, but Derek could feel them shift, stretching toward him, pressing in. He collapsed to his knees, gasping. The whispers reached a crescendo, a cacophony of voices calling his name. Then, silence. When Derek opened his eyes again, it was morning. Sunlight streamed through the hospital windows and everything looked normal. The bed was back in its proper place in room 312. The hallway was empty. Phones worked again. The intercom buzzed to life. Shaking, Derek left the floor. When he reported what had happened to his supervisor, she looked at him like he was crazy. No alarms had gone off. No staff reported anything unusual. Derek quit that day. He couldn't stay. He couldn't forget. Even now, months later, when he's alone in his apartment at night, he sometimes hears whispers, soft, urgent, calling his name. Sometimes he sees shadows in the corners of his vision that aren't there when he turns to look. And he knows, with a certainty that chills him to his bones, that some places, the ones that seem empty, quiet, safe, aren't safe at all. They watch. They wait. And they always, always remember you. Story the end. When I first started working as a night security guard at the roadside rest stop off I-71 in rural Kentucky, I thought it would be the easiest job I'd ever had. It was quiet, steady pay, and all I had to do was keep an eye on the property from midnight to 8 in the morning. The place wasn't big, 2 restroom buildings, a few vending machines, a truck parking area, and a narrow walking trail that disappeared into the woods behind the lot. The guy I replaced, an older man named Bill, met me before my first shift. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept right in years. He kept his sunglasses on even though it was after sunset. Before handing me the keys to the office, he said something that stuck with me. "If you see the woman by the woods," he said quietly, "don't talk to her. Don't even look too long. Just go inside and lock the door." I thought he was joking. He wasn't smiling. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent most of the time sitting in the small office by the front entrance, watching security feeds from a grainy old monitor. It showed the parking lots, vending machines, and the short trail leading into the trees. Most of the time, it was just empty. Truckers came and went through the night. Some would stop for a few hours of sleep, others just long enough to use the bathroom. Occasionally, a lost traveler would pull in for coffee and a snack, but by the end of my first week, little things started happening. Around 1:30 a.m. one night, the motion sensor on the trail camera went off. The monitor flickered, showing static, then came back. I thought maybe an animal had triggered it, but when I rewound the footage, I froze. There was a woman, or something that looked like one, standing at the tree line. She was wearing what looked like a long white dress, old-fashioned, maybe from decades ago. Her hair was long and dark, hanging over her face. She wasn't moving. She was just standing there, facing the camera. After a few seconds, the footage went black again. When I went out to check, she was gone. The woods were silent except for the distant hum of the highway. The next morning, I told the maintenance guy about it, half expecting him to laugh. Instead, his face went pale. "Don't mess with that," he said. "Bill saw her too. Everyone who's worked nights here has." I pressed him for more details, but he just shook his head and walked away. That night, I couldn't stop watching that trail camera. Every flicker of movement made my heart race. Around 2:10 a.m., I saw her again. Same spot, same stillness. Only this time, she was closer. I leaned toward the monitor. She was standing about halfway down the trail now, still facing the camera, but I could see more details. Her skin looked gray, her hands hanging stiff at her sides, fingers twisted and blackened like they'd been burned. The camera flickered again. When it came back, she was gone. I walked outside, flashlight in hand, telling myself it was probably just my imagination. But when I got to the start of the trail, the air felt wrong. Colder, heavier, like the atmosphere itself didn't belong to the rest of the world. I didn't go in. I just stared into the trees until I realized I was holding my breath. Something moved deeper in the woods, a faint sound of branches breaking. Then came a whisper. I couldn't tell if it was a voice or the wind, but it sounded like someone saying, "Help me." I ran back inside, locked the office door, and didn't leave until sunrise. By the end of the second week, I was running on fumes. I barely slept. The woman appeared every night now, always between 1 and 3 a.m., always getting closer to the rest area. I started noticing other things too. Lights flickering in the restroom building, the vending machine buttons pressing themselves, whispers coming from the intercom, even though the system hadn't worked in years. One night, just past 3 a.m., the monitor went completely dark. When it came back on, the woman was standing right in front of the camera, her face finally visible. Her eyes were white, her mouth open wide in a silent scream, and her skin hung loosely like it had been soaked in water. I stumbled back from the monitor, my chest tightening. The power went out. I sat there in the pitch black, listening to the hum of the vending machines dying one by one. The air grew colder. Then I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel just outside the office. Slow, dragging. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the door, but the beam flickered and died. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then a soft knock. 3 taps. I didn't move. After a few seconds, another knock came. Louder this time. Then a woman's voice, barely a whisper. Please, open the door. My throat went dry. I couldn't even breathe. Please, I'm lost. It sounded human. It sounded real. For a moment, I almost believed it was just a traveler, but something deep inside me told me not to move. Then she spoke again, her tone sharper, colder. I see you. I bolted to the far corner of the room, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The knocking stopped. The air grew still again. I sat there until dawn, not daring to look at the windows. When the sun finally rose, I found muddy footprints outside the office door, small, barefoot prints that led back toward the woods. That morning, I went to talk to Bill, the guy who'd trained me. He was sitting in a diner a few miles down the highway, sipping coffee with shaking hands. When I told him what happened, he just nodded slowly. She gets close, he said. Closer every night. That's why I quit. The last night I was there, she was standing right behind me when the lights went out. I asked who she was. No one knows for sure, he said. Some say it's a woman who crashed her car near the woods back in the 70s. They never found her body. Others think she's something older, something that was already there long before the highway was built. He looked at me, his eyes bloodshot. Either way, if you stay long enough, she'll try to follow you home. I didn't believe that last part. Not until the following weekend. It was my 4th week on the job. I was sitting in my apartment trying to unwind when I heard it, the faint hum of static from my TV, even though it was turned off. Then a soft voice, almost familiar. Please, help me. The sound came from inside the TV, muffled, distorted, but I knew that voice. I unplugged everything and sat in silence for hours. When I finally slept, I dreamed of the woods behind the rest stop, the same trail, the same cold air, and that woman standing just a few feet away, reaching for me. I quit the job the next morning. Didn't even go back for my last paycheck. A few weeks later, I heard from Carla, one of the daytime clerks who'd stayed on after me. She said the new night guard lasted only 2 shifts. They found his office empty one morning, the door wide open, the monitors all frozen on the same image, the trail leading into the woods, and a faint figure standing just beyond the trees. No one ever saw him again. Sometimes, when I drive past that stretch of highway, I catch a glimpse of the rest stop from the road. It's still open, though the state's talking about closing it due to safety issues. If you look closely, and I've tried not to, you can see the woods behind it, dense and dark even in daylight. And sometimes, when the headlights hit the right angle, I swear I see a pale shape standing at the edge of those trees, watching the cars go by. I don't stop there anymore. I don't even slow down, but I still dream of her, standing by the woods, whispering my name, asking me to open the door. Story the end.